We used to make a big thing of streaming live, and now we just kind of do it as an audio backup.
Cool.
Mhm.
All right. Let's press this button. All right, here we go. This is SoundNotion, the podcast for new music and music news. I'm David McDonald.
I'm Nate Blyton.
And this week on the show, we're joined by violist Nadia Sirota. Nadia is going to be curating a series at Symphony Space in the next week, or I guess 2 weeks from now as we're recording this, February 1st through the 5th. And she is also, of course, the host of WQXR's Meet the Composer podcast, and she's also a total badass on the viola. So, Nadia, thank you for making some time for us this evening.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
So the project that you have seemingly most immediately coming up is this series at Symphony Space. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so the Symphony Space project, it's 4 concerts. It's the 1st, the 2nd, the 4th, and the 5th. And 3 of them are in the little space, the Thalia or however you pronounce it. And one of them is in the big space. And the big space concert's kind of a crazy thing. The first half is sort of a grab bag of music from members of the bedroom community, which is, among other things, a record label out of Iceland where I've been recording for the past few years. Actually, 10 years. It's more than a few.
Cool.
So there's going to be like a sort of bunch of different stuff by Valgeir Sigurdsson and Nico Muley. And we have a gamba player called Liam Byrne who's going to be there. So that's sort of the first half of the concert on the 5th. And the second half is this crazy thing that we just finished recording. So I actually got back from Iceland. I got back on the 22nd of December. And this Irish composer called Donncha Dennehy has written an amazing thing, which is an album-length thing, a short album-length thing. It's a 38-minute long piece for... As we recorded it, it's 11 viola da gamba parts and 4 viola parts.
Wow.
And what we're doing at Symphony Space is a version of it with 1 solo viola and 4 bass viols and sort of backing track. And it's a very, very cool piece because I'm not sure I've really heard anything before where the highest voice, actually all of the gambas are bass viols, so they're sort of big cello-looking things with guitar fretboards and like 6 or 7 strings. And the bass viol is actually quite bright in its timbre, and the viola, which is the highest instrument technically, is very dark. So it's got this ridiculous, amazing sonority just to start with. And then second of all, Donncha likes to sort of go back and forth between equal temperament and just intonation. So the whole piece will be kind of trucking along and then get kind of like perverted into this really cool otherworldly thing. And it's a beautiful, awesome piece, and we haven't even quite figured out how we're going to do it live yet, so everyone should come to that for sure.
That's really interesting hearing you describe this creation process that seems to be so much informed by a recording studio.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of your work as a performer has to do with the middle ground between kind of indie rock, folk rock kind of stuff and the long hair classical kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering how this creative process goes with Donncha Dennehy in the studio. Is this does it have the feel of a rock record? Is it kind of that creative process of a lot of back and forth and real-time collaboration?
Yeah, I'm not sure rock record is exactly the right thing to say, but I will say that it's a process that, at least for Donncha, is new, and for me, coming from a very like capital C classical background, is also kind of new. Basically we got together in the end of the summer in August, and Donncha had written sort of a bunch of the piece, kind of 10 minutes of the piece, and we sort of got together and played around, and the piece dramatically changed at that point. We started playing around with stuff like canon and pulling phrases longer and things that we could do very quickly with electronics to the material, and using that to inform what the piece would end up being in its sort of final incarnation, and using the studio to be able to sort of audition some concepts, formal and otherwise, is a pretty cool thing, and I think Donncha hadn't quite done anything that way before. So the piece definitely exists in a different form than it would if we hadn't had the studio as a resource. And also the fact that, you know, it's a piece for 15 or 16 voices that was performed by 2 people, and that was always going to be part of the recording. Also the idea that we're making the record first and figuring out the live performable element of it second, which is not a very classical music idea if you think about that.
Right.
So,
it's
and
almost as though
sorry,
you
yeah.
created the work with all of the gear in the studio, and then you just transcribe it for a live performance and like come as close as you can. But the original work is really this studio creation.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't quite heard the final live version, so I can't really speak to whether or not that's 1,000,000,000% true. But there's definitely some portion of that that's super true. The other thing that's crazy is like the gamba has frets, and we're dealing with 2 different types of tunings.
I was going to ask about that. How do you change tunings?
So we're figuring. So in the studio, it's easy because you just stop, retune, and start again.
Yeah.
But live, it's going to be kind of a different situation. So I think we figured out it's going to be 3 gambas tuned to A equals 492, and 1 gamba tuned to A equals 440. Plus, each gamba is going to have an extra fret, so that they can get some weird microtones in between the places. And we haven't quite figured out the distribution of microtones or whatever. But in the studio, it was great because we'd just stop, tune up stuff, split frets or add frets, figure it out, tune it to an app, and like make sure everything just intonationally was really like completely above board.
I have a practical question at this point.
Yeah.
Where do you find 11 viola da gamba players who are willing to do this weird microtonal music on gamba?
Thus far, I've found 4.
Cool.
And right now, you know, I haven't had rehearsal with them, but I think that, to be fair, like period instrument people are weirdos, you know. So getting them to go.
As evidenced by the fact that they are period instrument people.
This
right?
is what
They're
I'm saying.
very similar to us weird new music people weirdos.
Exactly, and they're already used to a billion different systems of tuning, you know. So actually, on some level, this is something that's slightly an easier stretch than maybe your like standard run-of-the-mill concerto student or whatever.
Yeah.
Dave, did you say that period instrument people are like cosplay musicians?
I had a friend that said that. That's not my words.
That's really
but very good.
I like that. That's really good.
Yeah, they're basically going to some weird, even nerdier version of Comic-Con.
It's definitely deep nerddom, but in a wonderful way. And actually, the coolest thing just about being able to be around this viol for a while and play with it, see like what actually is possible, has been like a super fascinating process for me, and I think for Donica as well. It's not something I've ever like experimented with creatively. And we always joke about the fact that like what we do is new music for old instruments, but this is new music for like older instruments, you know.
Really old instruments, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
So
funny.
when I'm looking over some of the names that are associated with this residency at Symphony Space, it looks like a list of a lot of the names that I have read from previous projects that you've done, and a lot of these names have come up on your Meet the Composer show before. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the kind of ongoing relationship you have with some of these musicians and composers that are associated with this festival.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything is sort of coming from a deeply selfish place from my perspective. I love these people and I love the music that they do, and I'm hoping to try to continue to come up with circumstances where they can write new stuff and I can play it. So this residency was a great excuse basically to get a whole bunch of new music from people that I really, really care about. So the other 3 shows, the prior to that sort of big show in the sharp space, the large space, are sort of more workshop-y, smaller things. The first show on the 1st is it's gonna be more gambas, like tons of gambas. I'm gonna use all the gambas that we can get. But this will
basically use every gamba in New York, I think, by the end of this.
I hope so. I mean, again, eventually, like it'll be all the gambas we can find. But right now, we're just starting with 4 or 5. I'm actually making my friend, who is a cello player, learn the gamba for the sake of concision of personnel, and I think he's freaking out. But he'll get really good. I know he will.
It's good for him.
Yeah, exactly. But that first show is going to have some old music, some Pickforth and Agricola and Bird and Gibbons, in addition to some David Lang and some Nico Muhly. And actually, there's a brand new David Lang piece, which I haven't even seen yet.
That's exciting.
Yeah, for viola and viol, that'll be on that program as well.
Well,
and the world's most gorgeous thing that he's ever he wrote called Just, which is this piece for three voices and viola, cello, and percussion after Song of Songs, which is just super, super stunning. And it's part of that soundtrack to that movie that he just got nominated for an Academy Award for or whatever.
Very cool. So I am curious, with those two composers in particular, David Lang and Nico Muhly, some of their music has a lot of very direct, overt references to old music. Is that where this pairing comes from, or do you just happen to put some people together that you think are interesting as a group?
No, that's deeply by design. One of the big sort of impetuses. What's the single impetuses? Well, one of the big sort of inspiring factors to this entire series was the Donica piece. And I was like, well, so long as I have all these viols lying around, might as well do something with them that kind of pulls the old and the new together. So that's that whole first concert. The second concert is a sort of Valgeir Sigurðsson with video extravaganza, and we're going to be doing some stuff from Dreamland, which is a film about nature in Iceland that he has written the score to, as well as a couple of other projects of his, including Wide Slumber, which is this crazy sort of visual puppetry and sung opera oratorio thing about collecting moths and insects.
Is this performed live?
Yeah, so we'll be performing excerpts from all this stuff live, and there'll be some kind of visual element from all of the different type of things.
Wow.
So is the video or visual element, is that also created live, or is that like pre-recorded thing?
That's canned, super pre-recorded.
That's very safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is mostly it's a concert with sort of a visual element, and I think the Thalia used to be a movie theater, so it's kind of going to be a nice area to do that.
Okay.
And then the third concert is me and Richard Reed Parry, who is a bass player and composer, and we're going to be playing a bunch of stuff that he's composed, including a brand new solo viola piece, and then some of his work for instruments and heart and breath. And he does these really cool pieces where you basically wear a stethoscope, listen to the speed of your heartbeat, and play your material at that speed. So basically he's using the unconscious systems of our bodies as like an aleatoric organizing principle. And he writes these really beautiful pieces that are always slightly different, but the thing that you become extraordinarily aware of is that there is this rhythm that exists in the room, sort of despite music happening or not. And it's actually kind of a beautiful and very sort of poignant effect. So
I would think that as you rely on your heartbeat for information about like tempo, that could get dangerous quickly.
Well, the joke is, and it's super true, is that every single concert has gone so much faster than the rehearsal.
Right?
Because you get on stage and all of a sudden, like, it's sometimes by minutes, like it'll be 5 minutes shorter or something, which is really crazy. So you have to allow for that to be kind of a changeable thing.
Yeah.
You practice for that.
I mean, you could definitely run around the room and do some jumping jacks before you rehearse if you needed to.
Yeah.
That's actually what they say you're supposed to do to practice nerves in general. I remember doing that in conservatory.
Interesting. I could see like playing for somebody you're really intimidated by or something too, but yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. You got to practice performing, is what they say.
Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned Richard Reed Parry and Valgeir Sigurðsson. I've personally, so I'm a a viola player, really into popular music land,
Oh,
and
cool.
And we're all composers and have done different kind of collaborative works and stuff. And you describe yourself as a capital C composer, but in your discography, there are so many of my favorite pop albums as well. What has that process been like? Just working with all of, like, do they always give you scores, or is it ever a collaborative thing?
Yeah, I feel like I've done this a bunch of different ways, and there's
Yeah.
probably more coming. Every artist has a different process. Sometime, and also I'm in a sextet called Y Music, and we also work with a lot of bands and songwriters. And we sort of describe a spectrum of types of working relationships. One of them can be really simple. Sometimes they've done something like hire Nico Muhly to do arrangements, and when that happens, we tend to have beautiful, perfect parts that maybe we'll like change a dynamic on or cut a bit of later. But that's a pretty simple matter of going to the studio, sitting down, reading your part, and trying to do the best you can. Sometimes we'll get a audio file that is the song, and it's sort of like, think about what you might want to do. Sometimes you get like a vague instruction, like, I really am feeling a G here in some way, and like, go have fun. Sometimes it's about just like, oftentimes when I work with Valgir, actually, the pieces that he's created, I'll do like 14 passes just listening to the stuff that he's done and improvising.
Yeah.
And then he'll sort of take bits of this and bits of that and sort of crunch them all together and put stuff backwards and do his own kind of weird permutations on that. And then from that, we might go and make a score that is performable later. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can work, for sure.
Nice.
I'm really interested. You mentioned a couple of times now, either directly or indirectly, improvisation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a thing that a lot of, classically trained musicians are super comfortable with. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how you got into improvisation and where that comes from in your musical background?
Yeah, sure. I would definitely count myself among those musicians that was really uncomfortable with improvisation until, like now. However,
about 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly. However, I've tricked myself into it, and it turns out it's awesome and wonderful. And actually, one of the best things for me has been processes like I was just talking about with Valgir, where there is this sense of like, oh, we're just going to do 14 passes of this. If you do something that sucks, it doesn't matter. Like, that doesn't have to be part of this thing. And sort of allowing myself to, again, use the studio as kind of like a way to, as a tool for creation.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first time I was ever able to sort of let my ego go and just sort of try some stuff, and then some really cool stuff came out. So that was sort of the first step for me. And actually, more recently, like, my Y Music has been on tour with Ben Folds, and he is like total guy who makes up songs on the spot all the time and just has us play them. And that's totally fine, well and good, and like usually I play like textural rhythm viola, and then every once in a while he'll be like, great viola cadenza, and I'm like, but when that's happening in front of thousands of people, you just have to do it. And so that's also been really helpful for me, like trial by fire of just trying to figure out how to make music live. And the truth is, man, classical musicians are so trained. Like, we have so many tools at our disposal. We're just kind of afraid to employ them. And again, for me, like, all of these circumstances which kind of tricked me into having to improvise have been really helpful. Now I want to get better at it. Now I want to like figure some stuff out.
Well, and we're trained for this like single shot, high stakes live performance thing, and we're not trained to make music in a recording studio where there's very low pressure for every individual take, and maybe on some grand cosmic scale, there's some amount of pressure on a project as a whole, in an hour-long project or something in the recording studio. But any individual pass is, especially today with digital stuff, basically free. So it's really interesting. I like that, using the kind of low pressure situation of a recording studio as almost like a training ground for improvisation. And then by the time you're comfortable with it, then go out and hang with Ben Folds in front of a few thousand people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I've come to really love the studio. I love the environment of the studio. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's that combination of high pressure and low pressure. Like, to a certain extent, it's all very important, right? So you're kind of up, your energy level is up, and your performance brain is kicked in to a certain extent. But that having been said, there's all of this flexibility there. And I think I like the kind of thinking on your feet way that my brain kind of reacts to that set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And especially now that I've learned what you can use the studio for and all the tools that are sort of available, or I haven't learned all of them, so that there are a lot of tools available and tons of stuff to explore, like it becomes more and more exciting.
Interesting. Your experience in the studio of doing all of these albums, doing all these projects, has that gone the other way of affecting or like informing your performance in the classical land as well?
Probably. I think one of the bigger things that exists probably across the board is that I often play amplified. And the way that I play close mic'd is really different than the way that I play when there's no mic. Like I was thinking the other day, playing this viola concerto that Nico wrote with the Detroit Symphony, and that is all about projection, and like if you were right up near the instrument, you would hear some nasty stuff happening,
Sure.
But like when you're playing out to the back of the hall or whatever, like that's a whole different type of presentation. Whereas when I'm close mic'd, you can get some crazy sounds too. It's just like it's a very different way, and being able to zoom in and out with your ear and with your physicality, I think is something I definitely picked up in the studio. And I'm sure there's other things too that I'm not thinking of right now.
Do you ever hear yourself after one of these sessions in the studio and find that you are surprised, whether pleasantly surprised or less pleasantly surprised at what it sounds like, and think, wow, whoever played that viola lick they're pretty good.
Oh, all the time. I mean, all the time. No, I mean both high and low on that. It's also amazing because you think about different mics and different rooms and like all the stuff that affects your sound. I remember like someone put like a U67 on me in like a really old, beautiful wood studio, and I went into the booth and was just like, I sound like $1 million. Like that's so cool. And sometimes that's not exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating process. It really, really is. And I find that as used to the process as I am, there's always some surprise. There's always some moment of like, oh, whoa, this is not exactly what I thought was going on. Actually, one of the reasons I really love working at Greenhouse is that the room in which I tend to record is this upstairs room where the engineer and the performers can actually be in the same room at the same time. And what's really lovely about that is I don't feel like I'm playing into a glass wall. I don't feel like I'm playing in a cubicle for myself. I'm like actually performing for the engineer, and then we can hear stuff back over the speakers, without a lot of choreography, which is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Did you did you have any experience working in a recording studio or handling yourself in that environment at all in your schooling when you were in your studies?
Not in a recording studio, not really. I took some sort of music technology classes in high school. I actually was screwing around with Max MSP a little bit in high school, which I think wasn't super common to other people of my general vintage.
Yeah.
But I didn't actually have any experience in a recording studio until probably well into my master's degree, if not when I was out of school. And I actually remember doing a couple gigs where I was like recording jingles or whatever, and just the fact of playing with headphones on was a really jarring experience for me. And you'll see performers oftentimes in studio sessions really be thrown by an element like that, or playing to click track or stuff like that, which at this point in my life is so comfortable. It's a very comfortable place, and it's very second nature. And dealing with the breakout boxes and like doing little mixes and stuff like that, which doesn't seem like a big deal. It definitely took a little bit of getting used to. And yeah, to answer your question, no, I didn't really have that in school.
Right. Well, it's amazing to see people in the classical, for lack of a better word, classical world engaging the recording studio in a way that treats the recording studio like an instrument. I was listening to the Nico Muhly Meet the Composer on the way home. I just drove 3 hours. That's why I was a little late.
Oh my gosh.
And there's I can't even remember who was speaking at the time. It talks about it was really different in Nico Muhly's early work, doing stuff where you're not treating it like I'm making a score, and then I'm going to give it to this large ensemble, and they're going to rehearse the crap out of it, and then they're going to get one shot with some mics in the room, it was a recording session, which is something that I don't think classical musicians, well, composers absolutely have for a long time, but I think we're just now starting to get where your average viola player, as an example, thinks, oh, that's something that I could do too. You know, some buddies and I could get together and use a recording studio in that way as an instrument, not just as something that reproduces, you know, the sound of my instrument. What do you think about the time you've spent learning about that stuff? And what do you think about the place it should maybe have in school for up-and-coming musicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the reason for this being kind of a new concept is that the technology it's not that old compared to the technology that I used to play my viola, which is like, what, 16th century technology.
Mm-hmm.
The studio as a tool and like all of these things are relatively new. And also the version of that which is available to sort of most home cooks, that's not what I meant, but like, you know, home artists and is replicable in your living room or whatever, that's really, really new.
Mm-hmm.
So to a certain extent, I think one of the most exciting things about this new technology is that people across genre are learning it at the same time, or they're being exposed to it and like tweaking it out at the same time. Everyone's sort of finding new stuff all the time because, again, the tools are so new, which I think is one of the reasons that it's very cool to that there is so much cross-pollination between genres right now. I think we're all sort of very excited by these new tools at our disposal. But in terms of like the classical music community getting into them, I think it's happening. I think it's a little bit slower, but again, like the conservatory tradition, which is a baller tradition, which I love, still has. I mean, that's super old. That is a curriculum that's been honed over hundreds of years, literally. So adding stuff to it, I guess it's a slower process than it might be. But I think that I'm seeing schools really get more into this as the years progress. Like, it's different now than it was literally 5 years ago. So that's exciting.
One concern I always kind of have when I see the way sometimes it's implemented is that it feels, in some cases, a little inauthentic. It feels like they're doing this thing because they feel like they should, and they should, so I guess it's good that they feel that way, but it just seems like they're, you know, doing this imitation of hipness rather than actually being hip, you know?
I mean, yeah, sure. I don't know. I think it's it's complicated to come up with reasonable curricula. It's like everyone is also trying to make a sort of business of music, entrepreneurship moment right now in music schools, and they're right, they should do it, and I have yet to see it done really well. But I think that sometimes just sort of hurling yourself at a problem and trying a bunch of solutions is better than not doing that. Hopefully eventually people will find that curriculum, hopefully with regards to studio work and using the tools that are now available, people will get better and better at that too. You know, I can't really say anything. I'm sure there are some brilliant people out there that can come up with better curriculums for all of that stuff, and they should. But it might just take a little time.
I also sometimes wonder if maybe the best thing to do is not to actually try to teach certain things in school, but just to say, if this is the thing you want to do, or better yet, this is the thing you should want to do, and the best way to learn how to do it is just to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And like so many times, a student will come to me and say, "Hey, how do I do whatever?" And I don't know, just start doing it and see how it goes. Like, there's not a rule book for how to make music for video games. I mean, there are some pretty dorky texts that you can buy, but there's the only way to practice doing it, the only way to get good at doing it is to do it.
Yeah, just try it.
And I feel like that's the case with a lot of these kind of intermediate things and these entrepreneurial things. You know, you mentioned the kind of entrepreneurial business moment in music schools, and certainly there are some, you know, there is some book learning to be had on those topics, but at some point, much like performing, if you're not doing it, you're not going to learn how to do it.
Yeah. Like, Y Music is the group that people who are trying to teach an entrepreneurial class point at the group and say, look at that group. Y Music is awesome. See what they did? Instead, try to get them to go out and do something like Y Music instead of learn that Y Music is cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a combination of all these things. Like, to a certain extent, if you put on a show and you forget to order chairs and then no one has a place to sit, it's a really helpful lesson that you should always think about having chairs,
Yeah.
And so those things really do help. And Practica, I think, are, for some people, it's really a great way to learn. But actually, I'm discovering the weird thing about getting older is, like, people kind of solidify into their selves. And I'm sort of discovering all these people around me. I'm the kind of person who would happily hurl myself at a problem, try a billion different things, like mess up 50 of them, be psyched at the 2 that work, and move on. I also have a lot of friends who are solidifying into their selfie selves, who would never do anything without, like, writing it all out and making sure they know exactly what they think is going to happen before they try. And I think one of the real challenges in education is trying to teach to a lot of different types of people. So I think that when it comes to creating a curriculum like we're talking about, there aren't any real solid answers. I think what you're talking about, just like give it a go, that totally works for a lot of people, and it would definitely work for me, for example. But I think there's a lot of people out there who would love to have a little bit of sort of reflective time, see like 15 examples of it, honestly, and then just sort of go and do it in their own way after that.
Yeah, it feels like some themes here. Like you mentioned how you kind of tricked yourself into becoming comfortable with improvising over just from doing it, and I have to wonder, like, how. I mean, I know there are some programs at different schools about introducing improvising for classical players and doing different things with that. But that seems like a particularly interesting thing to me.
It is a question, right? Because I think there's definitely. I would love to take like those classes at this point. I think because I got past the major mental hurdle, but I'm not sure how to get past the mental hurdle without just like doing it. Yeah. I don't know.
I think there is something to be said regarding your comment earlier about the systematic kind of attack on a problem of trying something, and the very, almost passive research-based thing. And I think those two things can work together, but they both have this kind of overarching thing that I think is good for students to get in schools, is to learn how to research and solve problems.
Yeah, for sure.
And whether you do that by, slamming your head at them and failing 50 times, or whether you make 87 spreadsheets and all have very nicely detailed forms, I think they can both work. But you're still solving problems, and to do it successfully and repeatably, you should have some kind of plan or system in mind. And I feel like maybe that's the thing that we're not doing a very good job at teaching in schools.
Yeah, I mean, again, for people that learn like me, I always found that the most incredibly motivating thing was just a concert, like a final event. So if I had to play something in front of other people, or if I had to have some skill and do it in front of other people, I'd figure it out. So that was, for me, accountability. And when it comes to sort of these curricula in terms of entrepreneurship or anything, like, I taught a class for like 20 seconds that was like, hey, put on a concert outside of this building. And that was literally the whole class. Just do that, and I'll help you with problems as they arise,
Nice.
And
That's an awesome class.
Yeah. I mean, that can work. It was a helpful, but again, it's very like practicum based. I'm not sure how to teach that class in another way, but I'm sure there are people who have that brain who are like, these are all of the things that you're probably going to have to deal with. But
all you have to do to teach that class is at the very beginning make sure that they don't plug or unplug anything unless the volume is all the way down. After that, because that could blow something up, but after that, just let them go for it.
Well, and there's a bunch of like little things that you learn. Like, I have learned that one of the most important things you can ever do as a performing musician who tours around the world is step 1, introduce yourself to the people that are helping you out technically. Learn their names and like be a nice human being, because you're going to need their help,
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that things are transactional, and that when you're touring around, you just have to rely on so many different people in so many different ways. So not being a dick is like a big part of learning how to be a musician.
Definitely.
Let me write that down.
Yeah, right.
It's funny that you say that because we've gotten to speak with a lot of musicians doing this show for the last 5 years, and we have talked to a lot of kind of people other than like the five of us that make the show nobody would care about, right?
Mhm.
And then we've talked to a lot of other people that are like kind of a big deal in the field, and it never ceases to amaze me that the people who are the kind of a big deal people are almost without exception the nicest people that we talk to, and the most thoughtful people, and the fastest to respond with emails, and like the most accommodating when things go wrong. I think that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, I try to be good at emails, although that's a uphill battle consistently.
Yeah. There's one other thing I wanted to ask about, like speaking of all this entrepreneurial and collaborating with different people and working with technicians. You had an album a couple years ago, and I have to imagine that must have been a real a real serious undertaking, reining in all these people and personalities. It was Baroque from 2013, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That album came together, in a piecemeal way, and I think most of them do. I really wanted to make a record that used the studio as much as I could. And for me, I'd done a lot of projects for other people that were using the studio, but this was like okay, if I'm going to make a record of pieces that were written for me, how can I make it in a way where I'm getting to explore as many textures and colors as I can using this resource, which was this amazing studio and these amazing artists and technicians in Iceland. So yeah, but it was one piece at a time, and actually we recorded way more stuff than we ended up using. It's complicated if you're making a record where every single piece is by a different person, because it's hard to figure out how to create a through line of a record that makes sense. And so my tack for that was just to record, because of the way that I was recording this piece in the studio. I have a great deal where it's not like by the hour. I'm not on the clock all the time, so I had the ability to sort of really play as much as I could. So I recorded everything I thought might go on the record, and then I pulled out I sort of found the record from that. So it was kind of like a sculpture type of album creation.
Nice.
And then the engineers and producers that I was working with on that album were really awesome at sort of talking to me about what my ideas were and ways that we could realize them technically. And we did things like, there was this great Yamaha home organ from 1982, the kind with a drum machine built inside, which was great. Totally. And we ended up remiking that through an amp in a room, and then EQing that, and all sorts of fun stuff that I would have never thought of personally. But I was able to be like, hey, I want this sound to be more sandpapery or whatever, and then we could figure out how to translate those ideas into sort of sonic things that we could do in the studio.
Nice. Well, and I suppose this transitions into this other wonderful project that you've been doing for such a long or for these last couple of years as well, the Meet the Composer podcast, where that's a whole set of technical challenges and interviewing people and putting together with music. What's it like putting that together each month?
Yeah, well, I very much have a partner in crime, whom I met at the studio in Iceland, where while I was making Baroque, he was an intern at the time, and was just really quick on his feet and really awesome at helping with stuff. And then he moved to New York, and I was like, hey, ever wanted to work in radio, kid? But at that point, I was, sort of hosting Q2, which was, that was this. This is this next piece. You just heard this piece. This is the next piece coming up, which doesn't require a lot of, really intense forethought. And I decided I wanted to see what I could do with the medium. And I hadn't ever really done any kind of real storytelling in radio or anything like that. And Alex Overington, who is my producer that I was just talking about, he also didn't have any radio background. So we kind of threw all of our music production and experience into the process of creating this podcast, and have been taking a lot of advice from more radio type people, and it's become something that I think both of us are super, super proud of. But the process is basically like we start with an interview. It's usually about a 2-hour-long interview, which we then pull all the cool tape from. We usually pull way too much material because we're trying to come up with an hour-long show. And then I tend to sort of like put everything in a row, write some voiceovers, get some supplemental interviews, and come up with like a basic form, and then I throw it at Alex, and he embroiders all this really cool stuff all over it sonically. So basically, he's sound design, and I'm structure and writing, if that makes sense.
Nice.
Well, there are certainly lots of heavily produced podcasts out there. When I first started listening to Meet the Composer, when it first started happening, I'm a big Radiolab fan. So have you heard this comparison before? I'm assuming the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, and we are very, very, very vocal about the fact that we are extraordinarily inspired by Radiolab. We're wearing our influences on our sleeves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would be proud if I were doing the same, and I would say the same.
But what's really cool at this point is we've gotten better, and I think that we're coming up with some cool ways of doing stuff and some cool ways of using music to tell stories, which I think has been very cool. I'm never quite expecting what Alex does to the show, and to me that's the sign of like a really great collaboration. Like he's never necessarily knows where I'm going with it, and I don't necessarily know where he's going with it, and then something will show up and it's like, wow, that's so much cooler than I thought it would be, that inspires me to get more creative and him to get more creative, and right now it's a really great collaboration.
Yeah.
But he's actually started working for Radiolab a bit too, so that's the tutor has become the 2D or whatever that's going to be.
Interesting.
Well, my wife had never heard the podcast before, and we listened to like 2.5 during the drive home, and she's totally hooked now.
Oh, nice.
And let me say, because they're allowing you to use the Detroit Symphony performance of you playing the viola concerto. We listened to the Nico Muhly episode. Very good job.
Thank you.
It's a very, very nice piece.
It's a beautiful piece, yeah. And the Detroit Symphony is awesome for letting us do that. I think it's a limited. It's like 3 months that we can do that, but their motto is the most accessible orchestra in the world, and they're really being amazing about that. Like,
cool.
I haven't really worked with a major orchestra that's been so open about like, yep, you can record this, yep, you can take that audio, yep, you can do all this stuff. So they're super amazing.
We actually, when we were starting doing this show, was during their really giant lockout strike thing in the like 2011-ish. And one of the things that I think was a big part of their new CBA when they got everybody back together was how they were going to deal with those digital streaming and recording rights. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to deal with orchestra recordings. We as composers have this issue all the time. I'm sure performers as well. You get this performance with this big time orchestra that you're super proud of, and then you can't share it with anybody because of whatever rules. And if you get a recording, it's got a bunch of extra noise added to it so that you can't use it for anything. And it's very, very frustrating. So it's like Sam said, it's super cool, and as you said, it's super cool of the DSO to let you have that recording and to share it publicly for free. And they do those kinds of things too. But that's I think a great example of the sort of thing that you've had on the show before. You've had other like brand new recorded performances that you've presented in your podcast feed before, and it's such a cool thing that you do.
Yeah, actually, I mean, so here's the whole like the rationale behind all of that to begin with. We wanted to figure out what we could do that was podcastable, and the truth is that means it's a talk show about music. So there's a lot that you can do sonically, but we never have more than 2 or 3 minutes of music in the clear. So to do a show about music with not that much music on it seemed a little bit like wasted efforts. Mm-hmm. So that's where the sort of bonus track idea came, which was let's always give people some music by the person we just spent an hour talking about and talking to. And actually, it turns out getting people to record stuff for you is way easier from a rights perspective than using a pre-existing recording. And it also means that like things are awesome and exclusive and whatever. And so actually being a performer myself, I was never scared to grab someone, bring them into the studio and do a recording. And like the John Luther Adams show, when we got the Jack Quartet to come in and do sort of a quick and dirty recording of The Wind in High Places about a half a year before they recorded it for real, is like a very cool thing to do, you know. And from my perspective, it's like, again, it's really similar to what I do in real life. I don't think radio is real life for me, confusingly, like this other thing. But yeah, it's very similar to what I do in real life, and so I figured why not sort of take that skill and bring it into this other thing.
I think it also really nicely solves like an artistic issue, I would think, of talking over the music. This is a thing a lot of radio and television and films about music end up giving you no more than 15 seconds of it at a time before somebody needs to start telling you about it, and that's really distracting from listening to the music. You know, I think on the main Meet the Composer show, you guys do a pretty good job of leaving some spaces for actually listening to sounds, but at the same time, I'm often not just on Meet the Composer. I'm often struck by, you know, the presenter's voice coming back in and thinking, I wish I could just listen to this music a little bit longer. But obviously that's not what the show is. And those bonus tracks are a really, really delightful way to solve that problem, I think.
Well, something else that I really appreciate, and I don't know how often you announce it on the show, but my wife enjoyed the fact that you could look at time code linked list of like where this sample of this thing came from, just in sort of the soundscape aspect, so that you can go and then hear that whole piece if you want. That's the part she was digging the most during the dry tunnel.
Yeah, that's been really important, just because I feel like, again, there's so many times where we're floating something in that might be, you know, music by a composer who the main composer's teacher studied with, right? And like we're just doing that so you have some kind of sonic bench post, and if you want to hear more of that piece, like you should be able to go check that piece a little bit more. But the idea behind the show, at least sonically, is that we're trying to always give reference. We're trying to always, you don't need to know anything going into this show. It's a show about music that was written 2 seconds ago. So you hopefully, as a new music or classical music or new music aficionado, can come to the show and get something out of it. And as a complete newbie, you can come in and get something out of it as well, because we're always trying to sort of give you a reference. It's very like internet linky, hyperlinky in the way that we go about it, just because it's the goal is to not ever leave anything sort of unaddressed. I'm sure we do know, you know, but that's the goal anyway.
When you were describing that, the first thing I thought was that sounds very web native, right? It sounds like a thing that was not designed necessarily for radio primarily, but designed for a medium where I can click a thing and be somewhere else, and click a thing and get a lot more background that's separate from the main thing. That's really cool. One of the things you mentioned just now was that you're talking to people who are interested in classical music, interested in recent music. I wonder how you think of as your audience member for making a show like that. This is a thing that we making shows here struggle with all the time, is, you know, how much background do we need to give, right?
Right.
We don't need to explain to our audience what a viola is,
right?
But maybe we do need to explain what a viola da gamba is.
Absolutely.
And I wonder the extent to which you struggle with that same thing, making Meet the Composer.
Oh, it's something we think about a lot. I think I decided early on that I'm not trying to make a show that's accessible to every single individual person who speaks English.
Mm-hmm.
But I am trying to make a show that's accessible to curious people. And so I feel like there's a ton of people who, for example, there'll be a new exhibition of modern art, and they didn't major in art history, and they're not artists themselves, and they'll go check it out, and that's not stressful for them. Or there'll be like a piece of contemporary fiction that, let's say, it wins a prize and it's in the paper, and people are like, I want to read that book. That sounds fascinating to me. I feel like new music should be the type of thing that an artistically curious person can approach in that exact same manner. In other words, when I go to an art exhibition, I don't necessarily know a ton about the artist before I get there. And hopefully the way that the thing is curated will allow me to sort of get the information that I need and experience that art in the way that I need to. The thing that's complicated about music is it exists in real time, and you are given a really specific time frame in which to enjoy that, which is different from visual art, which is different from writing. So what we're trying to do is give you enough information sort of as it's happening that that you can experience something in a way that's perhaps a little bit more detailed than if you went at it alone. And I find that actually a lot of our target audience has no idea that they want to be into contemporary classical music, but they listen to a ton of contemporary other music. Every other type of music tends to be new music, right? It's classical music is this one world in which new music is sort of ghettoized. So I feel like people are very used to listening to brand new stuff. They just they don't necessarily know that there's like an entire classical version of this, and that it's great, and that it's gorgeous and compelling. But to go back to your initial question, like, I don't feel like I necessarily need to define the word arpeggio. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But like, yeah. I will define just, you know, I will talk about like that, which for the record is a system of tuning based on the harmonic series, which exists all around us and is different than the way that we normally tune violins and pianos and stuff.
Mm-hmm. But see, that's a wormhole that you can. Then, if somebody asks one more question, it's like, well, it's too complicated to tell you anymore.
Yeah, but that's the cool thing about this medium. We can show. You know, explaining it is complicated, but listening to it is actually a very quick thing, right? You can be like, this is this chord chord tuned justly. Oh my God, it's very, very clear all of a sudden. So radio is actually a very cool medium for that. The other thing is that like you're supposed to, with radio, like be talking to one person at a time, right? That's the idea. You're talking to like one listener. Yeah. And that's an incredibly generous thing, actually, when it comes to like, look at all of this information that we're giving to you. It's a really cool relationship. I love it. I actually think radio is incredible, intimate, wonderful medium.
Have you? What's the feedback been? Have you heard from people who've listened to the show and like decided from listening to the show, oh, you know what, this Nico Mealy kid, I should listen to some more of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's really the goal. We got a big boost last year because Radiolab featured about 15 minutes of our John Luther Adams show on their podcast. Nice. And then that was played on air a few times, and so that bumped up our listenership by many factors of 10, honestly. But you know, your average Radiolab listener doesn't necessarily know much about classical music, and that's when we started getting some really great letters of like, I had no idea that John Luther Adams was a cool dude. I want to go check him out, you know.
But your average Radiolab listener does like have a New Yorker tote bag and do those things.
Yeah, and you know, to be perfectly honest, I'm like, this is the most NPR-y, NPR-ish NPR that ever did NPR, and I'm aware of that. You know, I'm not trying to like run away from that part of the identity, but yeah, I find that it's incredibly gratifying to get more people to come and listen to what we do. I think that the classical music tradition is rich and amazing, and I think that new music is rich and amazing, and there's not any risk of bringing people over here and having them be horrifyingly disappointed. So I will proselytize as much as I can.
Well, we promised you that we wouldn't keep you longer than an hour. We're coming right up on our hour, so I want to respect your time. I don't think I'm going to hit the post. We don't have posts. There's no feed going in.
Yeah, welcome to internet radio. It's so much better.
We do anything we want, anytime we want. We normally do the show 9 hours ago, and we said, you know what? Let's do it later.
I would feel horrible if while I had you, I didn't say, try to get Paulina Oliveras on the show.
Right on. Yeah, that's a cool
I would love to hear you talk to her for a while because she's so eccentrically cool.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
She's one of those people who is as interesting a person as her music sounds like she might be.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's awesome.
So Nadia, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. We really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Aside from this Symphony Space thing and the podcast, which we've been talking about, is there anything else coming up that you want to plug, or any place people can go for more information?
Yeah, go to nadiasirota.com for more information. There's links to all sorts of different projects. I think that my website's in reasonable shape right now. And I'm a little bit like blindery with regards to projects. Like, I think really far in the future, and I think straight in front of me. So right now the things... Oh, well, if anyone is in D.C., I'm playing a recital in D.C. on the 24th, which is Sunday. I don't know when this is going to air or if it airs or what that means, but... Internet.
I'm sure.
It'll be posted.
Probably in the next 24 hours-ish.
Yeah, perfect. So if you're bored a week on Sunday on the 24th at 4 p.m. and you live in Washington, D.C., come to the Phillips Collection. Check it out.
Sounds great. We'll have links to those things and more in our show notes, and if you're listening to this, you can find those show notes at soundnotion.tv/SN. You find links to all the stories we talked about, all of the other events and things that we do at SoundNotion. You can also follow us on Twitter. We're at SoundNotion on Twitter. We're all individually on Twitter. I'm Dave McDough. Nate is a Nate Tree. Sam is Housegoy, and Nadia is Nadia Sirota. You can find all of those things on Twitter. We'll have links to those as well. If you would like to subscribe to our show, please do that. You can catch all the shows automatically downloaded to your favorite device. And the best way that you can help out the show is to help people find it. And the best way to help people find the show is to leave a review in iTunes. And as I always like to say, we only read the ones that are 5-star reviews. So if you don't like the show and you'd like us to change something about it, you should leave us a 5-star review and tell us how much you hate it. Because I think that's really an effective way to get my attention. So thank you all so much for watching or listening. And of course, thank you again to Nadia for your time this evening. And that's going to do it for this week's episode of SoundNotion. We'll see you back next week.
Right on the button with the time, man. Well done.
Don't be a dick.
Don't be a dick. Okay, see you guys.
Wait,
That was my...
Bye-bye, Nadia. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thanks
so
for
much.
freaking-